This is the MeatEater podcast. We're recording in Seattle, Washington, not far from my house, in a rental house that the t-shirt magnate Janis Putelis rented for a shoot. Do you guys have you ever bought one of Janis' t-shirts?
I have not.
That's Randall, our guest, Randall Williams, admitting to having not bought one of Janis's Hunt to Eat t-shirts. Andy?
I'm interested in these t-shirts he's got for sale.
I just made a sale for you, Janis.
Thank you.
That's a very old... Andy, how long have we been friends?
Probably goes back to, mid-90s maybe?
We've been friends almost half the time that I've been alive. Yeah. Just about dead nuts half the time I've been alive. Andy was like, you were still becoming one, but you were the first chef I ever actually met.
Yeah.
Besides like a dude who cooks fried food in a bar.
Yeah. Actually, when you were
training to be a chef.
When our paths crossed, I was just starting culinary school.
Oh.
Yeah, that was probably 96, right in there.
Where was that? Ferris State?
In Grand Rapids, Michigan. So just down the road from Ferris.
Yeah, I was at GV. I went to, I graduated from the third college that I enrolled in. But you were at the culinary arts program.
Yeah, I was at Grand Valley for a little bit, and then switched gears and ended up at the culinary program right there in downtown Grand Rapids. That was fun. That was a fun time.
We did the first meal thing we ever did, besides cooking steelhead or something, was when we cooked. We had a pig with a roadkill deer.
We did.
And we sewed I believe we sewed the roadkill deer inside of a pig.
Yeah.
And had a party.
Big old party, yeah.
Wild game party.
Big pig, small deer, or what?
No, we were coming back. Me and my brother Matt were coming back from fishing in the PM. Remember the PM from Michigan? We were coming back from fishing salmon. Must have been late summer. Coming back from fishing salmon on the PM. Guy in front of us hit a deer with his car. He didn't want it. We called the cops. Cops gave us... No, we never even got... I'm sure the statute of limitations is worn out by now. Did not get a permit for the deer. Drove the deer from Baldwin down to Grand Rapids and hung it in a garage at a house we were renting. And this was a full-on flop house. I mean, none of the dudes that lived in that house were on that lease. Probably.
Well, a funny side note about that story is me and Mark Schmidt were up in that same neck of the woods the same time you guys were, and we were coming home the morning after that and saw that gut pile on the side of the road.
Is that right?
And made mention of it, and then got all the way back to our house, opened the garage door, and there was that deer hanging. And
I think put that together.
We pieced it together.
Because you knew we were up there.
Yeah.
That's a great recipe. To put a deer cut up in a pig. And I think we sewed it with baling wire. God, it was 20 years ago, though. Yeah. Anyhow, that's not what we were talking about. So, Janis Putelis, plug your t-shirts, Yanni. Janis is the only compensation. Janis gets so little out of this. Let's talk. Tell him about your t-shirts.
No, this has really helped our t-shirt business. And by the time you guys listen to this, we're going to have Texas t-shirts and Montana t-shirts.
So Yanni makes t-shirts Hunt to Eat. And he had an original one that wasn't state specific. Then did Colorado, because that's his roots are in Colorado. Then now you're doing Texas. It's got a big fence on it. It's got an 8-foot fence and a corn feeder. No, I'm joking. It's made to look like the Texas flag, Texas license plate. He's coming out with Montana, doing Alaska. We've been trying to talk him into doing Jersey. She hasn't gotten around to yet. So yeah, hunteat.com. Go buy one of Yanni's t-shirts. The reason we're here to talk, though, Randall Williams. Now, when I went after regular college. I went to graduate school. When I was in graduate school, I took a class with an environmental historian by the name of Dan Flores. And if you ever want to read great history stuff, go check out Dan's books. But Dan writes a lot of, I mean, some of his most influential, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's one of the most cited, like when an academic does a paper, one way to gauge, like writes an article, they'll call it a paper, right? And they'll publish it. A way to gauge a paper's success is how many times it's cited, right?
Right.
And his thing, bison ecology, bison diplomacy, is cited and anthologized, and it's just like that has to be like a hugely successful paper, right?
Yeah, no, that's from the Journal of American History, which is a really prestigious journal, and I think that was from '94 maybe, and it's been reproduced in countless anthologies.
You see it everywhere.
Yeah.
And in it, Dan Flores argues quite beautifully that the Plains Indians had never reached equilibrium with the bison herds. And that correct me if I'm wrong, I'm sure you know this way better than I do, Randall. And he argues, had you just introduced the firearm and the horse, you'd have eventually had the same outcome.
Yeah, I mean, the larger argument is essentially that there are so many variables that go into determining what the bison population of the plains would be, that you can't simply blame this mass extinction on market hunters at the end of the 19th century, because that's always been what most historians have done, is to blame white market hunters, the industrial hide hunt, for the extinction of, or the near extinction of the bison. And so Dan is arguing that there are larger climactic patterns, periods of drought on the plains that affect bison populations. Native hunters, they had their long-standing traditions and practices changed wholesale with the introduction of the horse and the firearm, and
the opening of markets, probably.
Yeah, the opening of markets, and Indians participated in the market hunting as well. And so, essentially, what his article does is it takes this story that had really been rendered into something of morality play, and makes it much more complex, and I think ultimately much more interesting.
Yeah.
So yeah, that's sort of the gist of the bison piece.
Yeah, I don't want to dwell on that. I'm just getting to Dan. I met you through Dan.
Sure.
But the reason, like, I wrote about that animal not from an academic standpoint, but more from a popular standpoint. But I became I tried to become versed in these various arguments. I think that a thing about like why the hide hunter thing was so dramatic is it was so complete and final, that even though those guys were coming in and whittling away at what was maybe just a fraction of the animals, the fashionable number for bison in the U.S., the fashionable number, buffalo bison, is the same damn thing. The fashionable number used to be like 60 million. And that came from some really strange calculations by a guy named Ernest Seton, right? He read about a big herd that Colonel Dodge, who Dodge gave the name to Dodge City. Colonel Dodge was like, I saw a big ass herd of buffalo. It took this many days to pass. It was this many miles wide. So Seton went and said, wow, there must have been X number in that herd. He's like, there must have been, I don't know, whatever million animals in that herd. And they lived here. And so there's probably like 6 or 7 or 8 other areas that are that big. And so each of those areas has that many. And that became how you always heard that there were 60 million of these animals at the time of European colonization. Now the fashionable figure is, you see often, maybe it's changed because it's been a few years since I've been in the game, the fashionable figure is 28 to 32 million, But the thing that's weird about it is you get where by the time the hide hunters, like by the time Euro-American hide hunters came on the scene and were shooting them to put on rail cars, to send the hides on rail cars to the east to have them tanned, there were way fewer.
Yeah, and it was already a vulnerable population.
Yeah, because by the end of the Civil War, that number, again, this is debatable, but a reasonable guess or a reasonable theory would be that by the end of the Civil War, you had maybe 15 million, maybe 10 million. So they've already been whacked down by a half, 2/3, and you wound up having these pretty big, substantial herds left. A couple, you'd have these herds of like a couple million, a million. And so to our eyes today, it would seem like unfathomable amounts of animals in a herd. And the hide hunters would roll in and they would kill thousands, you know? So it'd be like, right now we don't have nearly as many, take your pick. I don't know, name something, name an equivalent. We don't have nearly as many as we did at the time of European contact. Bighorn sheep. Okay. So if a bunch of guys went out right now and did their best to shoot every bighorn sheep, and they shot them pretty much all, would you later say, you know what happened to the bighorn sheep? These one assholes in 2015 shot them all. And then someone else would be like, oh no, because they were way down from all these other factors that have been playing out for the last 200 years. So it wasn't really that much of a sin because they were already missing from 90% of their range from 1900 when these dudes in 2015 went and shot the rest. Does that make the sin less or more? So the hide hunters shot a lot of shit. Maybe they didn't shoot 32 million, but they mopped up what was left of like some big herds that sure were a fraction of the original, but it's still kind of like catastrophic.
Yeah, and Dan's article basically highlights a whole host of factors that sort of set the stage for hide hunters to come in and just deliver the death blow. Yeah. Right. And so I think it was a pretty significant intervention, and sort of a controversial one too, because it disrupts, a lot of people like to make the past into simple morality plays, and the bison was always this example of just naked exploitation, greed.
Native Americans used every part of the animal.
Right.
Never wasted anything.
Right.
Complete sanctimonious, and then evil guys came in to starve the Indians.
Yeah, it's
just not true.
Right. And to acknowledge all these other factors that led to this catastrophe isn't to absolve hide hunters of any blame, right? It's not to sort of wipe the slate.
They had no idea,
right?
dude. They were uneducated guys. They were uneducated guys who were 19, 20 years old.
Yeah. And
I would have been a hide hunter.
Right.
Like, there's no way. Same way, like, when I was in my early 20s, I moved out to Montana because I wanted to hunt and fish. Remove any aspect of any idea about history, any idea about education, and I grew up on a farm in Michigan with no phone, no internet, no nothing, turned 20 years old, you can make money hunting buffalo, you go out and hunt buffalo, you have no idea what you're engaged in.
Right.
You might get it on some, like, it wasn't like an evil thing. This is the last thing I'm going to say about it, but later, Hornaday, who collected specimens for the Smithsonian, later he went to Miles City trying to find... He wanted to shoot a couple buffalo for the Smithsonian. They knew they were going to be gone. No, the Museum of Natural History. Sorry, I can't remember which one it was. Anyways, they wanted some collections. They wanted some pristine mounts before the animals were completely gone. He went out to Miles City. It was in late 1880s, I think, and he commented that in Miles City, the ranchers around there mostly came to that area because they were hide hunters. And they stuck around because they were convinced after they'd shot them all that there must be more somewhere, and they're just going to hang tight till they show up. And then a few years went by, and they all got into cattle ranching. They didn't even know what they had done. Yeah. There was rumors about a bunch in Canada. Millions would come from Canada. They weren't like, we got them all. Good job, boys.
Right. It's just the scale of that destruction is sort of unimaginable to us today. And so how could we even expect any of these guys running around to have any idea what they're doing?
I bet you illiteracy, and I'm not saying like it's a slam. Illiteracy was probably rampant among the hide hunters, and there was probably very little education among the hide hunters.
Oh, I'm sure, yeah.
They were, if you factor in where those guys are mostly from and where they wound up, and you do some kind of calculation in your head about communication and stuff, it would be like if you sent kids from here, from current day rural America to Kazakhstan, and told them that shoot that thing and we will pay you to shoot it.
Yeah, and
then to them be like, oh, dude, you didn't realize that the population's in Kazakhstan? It's like, it would mean nothing to them.
Yeah. Yeah, it was a lucrative business. You could make a lot of money just running around, rolling over bison, skinning them out, hire skinners.
$3, $4, $5 a piece.
Yeah, throw them on a train.
A hide was worth.
And then even still, it's not as if they're just doing this in a vacuum, right? The leather from these hides are going onto factory belts in Chicago and New York. It's fueling the Industrial Revolution.
Yeah.
To some degree. So yeah, I mean, they're part of they're cogs in a much larger process, and to place some sort of burden of guilt on them is I don't know, it's not a very intellectually serious exercise. So
they were filthy.
They were filthy.
They were filthy. No, but I only bring up the historian Dan Flores because Dan Flores contacted me and said that I should speak to you about your dissertation, which I'm going to have you explain. But first, explain for the listeners, like, what is a dissertation? You just finished your PhD?
I did. Yeah, I just
My
finished.
brother has one of those. He says he has two. And one of them stands for pretty huge.
Uh-huh.
Fill in the blank. But okay, explain what a dissertation is, like how that whole thing plays out.
Yeah, so the dissertation is the final step on the road to a doctoral degree, and
you did your doctoral work under Dan Flores.
Yeah, so Dan was my doctoral advisor, and I studied history at the University of Montana, environmental history. And
explain that real quick.
Environmental history?
Yeah, it's like in a nutshell.
Yeah, environmental historians are interested in questions pertaining to how humans in the past have interacted with the environment and how human behavior has shaped the environment, and also in turn how the environment has shaped human behavior. And so it's a relatively recent subfield, and it really came about in the 70s. Dan was one of the, there have always been intellectuals concerned with these questions, but in terms of sort of a professional subfield within history, environmental history came about really in the 70s as environmental concern became a large part of American life and
some
American
heavy hitters
politics.
in the field would be like Cronin, right?
Cronin is he's got a couple classic works.
Who's the guy that did the thing about the death of the frontier? Like, who wrote the thing declaring the frontier was dead in whatever year? Turner, yeah.
Yeah.
But Turner
Yeah.
wasn't an environmental historian.
No, Turner was a Western historian.
Frederick Jackson
Turner, yeah.
Yeah, Turner had this idea that he would look at the census data, right?
Right.
And one day found out that on the census report, things were in the U.S. were so lowly or so unpopulated that they would be called the frontier. And then one day a census came in and they realized there is no frontier anymore.
Right.
And he had this, and then was it Cronin that then kind of interpreted that later?
Well, yeah, almost all of Western history, it said, is sort of produced in conversation with Turner.
Is that right?
Yeah, Turner,
history of the American West.
History of the American West, yeah. and there's this long-standing debate about whether the West is a process or a place. And so Turner is really arguing that the West is a process, right? It's a process of frontier settlement. It's a process of sort of rendering wilderness into civilization, and that's sort of Turner's thesis. And he's writing at the turn of the 20th century, and he's looking at this census data and saying, well, once we as Americans run out of trees to cut down or sort of
bison to shoot,
right? Native peoples to fight. What effect is that going to have on the American people? Because he is really attributing a lot of the distinctive characteristics of American civilization to this process of westering or of sort of frontier settlement, and so he's tracing, the origins of America's democratic political culture to all of this quote unquote available land, right?
Yeah.
And so historians of the American West or Western historians, sort of interchangeable there. Throughout the 20th century have been trying to, because Turner was so influential, Western historians have been wrestling with this question of, is the West a process? Is it a place? I think environmental historians would argue that the West is a place and that it's defined by aridity. There are certain key characteristics, environmental characteristics, and also characteristics related to its political organization. The federal government is really inescapable in the West, whereas in the East, a lot of issues of governance are resolved at a municipal or a state level. Yeah. Whereas in the, you look at land ownership rates in the West.
You can live in a state that's 79, 80% federally owned land.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So this is, not to get into the minutia of the historiography in Western history, but basically there's this long-standing debate. Place, process, how do we define the West? If you say that you're interested in the American West and that's what you study, how do you define that?
Yep.
Is Alaska part of the West? Is Hawaii part of the West?
Yes, no. Am I right?
Well, it's this is what academics do, is you just come up with new and inventive questions to all these.
I just answered it. Yes, no.
Well, yeah.
I just got back from Hawaii. Yeah. I don't want to get into that, but I'd love to hear someone tell me like the pros and cons of calling it the West. So now you did your dissertation, which is like the final like
it's the final step.
I want to go way back for people who haven't dabbled around in college that much.
Sure.
Like when you go to college, you go to regular college, right? You get your 4 years. Then you probably did some kind of graduate degree, which took you 2 or 3 years.
Well, I went straight from so I did my undergraduate degree in Chicago. And then I came out to the University of Montana. I was admitted directly into the doctoral program.
And how many years did that take you?
5 years.
And how many years did you spend working on what would become your dissertation the whole time?
The whole time, yeah. It began, it's evolved over time, but it began in that first semester of graduate school. Okay.
So it's like it turned into a 5-year project.
Yeah, essentially. So I did 2 years of coursework, seminars, this and that. And then the next step is your comprehensive exam. So you come up with a list of the essential books in a number of fields. So I did 4 fields, and each of those lists is about 100 books. So you read, I read about 400 books, and you sit down and have a conversation with your advisors, and they, oral. You'll hear them call it oral
books.
More or less, yeah. Skimmed quite a few of them, but read strategically. So
you got kids?
I don't.
Man, that shit goes down the tube when you have kids, man. Well, I used to read I don't even want to start talking about that. I love them.
Yeah.
But the first thing that goes is the ability to read books.
Yeah, that's there's not a whole lot of glamour to graduate school or graduate studies in the humanities, but the sort of the undeniable luxury of it all is that people expect you to read a lot, and if that's something that you like doing, which is what drew me to it. You're expected to read a lot, and you have that time available. So
when I went to graduate school, all we did was read, man.
Yeah. So
that's all I did.
Yeah.
The amount of work you had to do for that, especially I was in fine arts.
Yeah.
Like writing. It's like basically it was like you could have summed it up by saying just go read for 2 years. Yeah. And then if you got time, write something.
Yeah. No. So that's what. Yeah. I did reading. The first 2 years are reading seminars and writing seminars. So in a reading seminar, you might read 10 books a term, and then in a writing seminar, you're expected to produce an article-length paper. And then after 2 years of that, you're sort of sent off to prepare for your exams and essentially master these fields. And then once you pass your exams, then you move on to the dissertation phase where you actually write. And what a dissertation is it's a book-length piece of writing that is expected or must make an original contribution to the literature. So you have to either engage with a new body of sources or engage with new questions or apply a new line of thinking to an old question, something along those lines. So you have to do something original, and basically it's sort of do you have the talent, do you have the requisite knowledge to be a practicing historian?
Yep.
And so it's a process of professionalization essentially.
Now, because there's probably some dudes sitting out there feeling like they tuned into the wrong thing because they're trying to listen to a hunting and fishing podcast. Reveal for me, what's the name of your dissertation?
So the name of my dissertation is Green Voters, Gun Voters, Hunting and Politics in Modern America.
Oh, man, that's rich. That's what I want to talk about. But before we get into that, give me a quick, if you had to do, what's your hunting and fishing background?
My hunting and fishing background, I grew up outside of Cincinnati, Ohio. Grew up fishing, and a group of friends and I in high school decided we want to get into hunting, and none of our...
Like your dads didn't hunt?
None of our dads hunted. Well, one of our friends... they just didn't grow up in a hunting family. So we sort of...
So you were like a self-taught guy?
Essentially. I mean, we read a lot of magazines. We watched a lot of shows. One of my buddies, my best friend, his dad did hunt, but his dad didn't take us all out hunting, right? So we sort of figured it out on our own. And it's a different ball game outside of Cincinnati, because you're sort of setting up a tree. We got into whitetail hunting. So it's find a game trail, set up a tree stand, sit, wait.
You guys didn't throw down a sack of carrots or anything?
No, we couldn't in Ohio.
Oh, really?
But so we got into it in high school, and we, growing up, we lived by the Little Miami River and would run around setting trot lines and fishing all summer,
right?
And that was our big thing. And so we're thinking, we should become hunters, and so we. That sort of led me to the project in some respects. Is what my source base for this project is pretty much just Field and Stream, Outdoor Life, local hunting and fishing columns, and so that's sort of how I was introduced to the sport primarily, and we did a lot of figuring out on our own. But these magazines have always been sort of a source of fascination for me, and also coming from a non-hunting family. In some respects, you feel like an observer, right? And so anyway, that's sort of my background. And now I'm out in Montana, and I just finished the doctorate, but past 6 years, I was in Alaska prior to going to Montana, and sort of I was split my time between guiding, fishing in Alaska in the summer, and then run back to Montana for the academic calendar. So it's been it's been a pretty good life so far. Yeah.
Where were you guiding up there?
South Central Alaska, about 100 miles northwest of Anchorage, an area called Lake Creek.
Doing for what?
Salmon and trout.
Yeah.
And it's just people come out, do fly-out trips for the week or for the day.
Out of a lodge or floating?
Out of a lodge, so we're just running jet sleds around, and it's good times.
Nice.
Yeah.
All right, so break down your research. Like, what'd you look at?
So I look primarily at, like I said, Field and Stream, Outdoor Life, nationally circulated hunting magazines.
For Fishing Game?
I didn't do fur fishing game.
No?
I know fur fishing game. At some point, you have to put the blinders on and just say, I think I've got what I need here, and you can always bring in
the big venerables though, like so Field and Stream, Outdoor Life, Sports
of Field, the big three. Yeah, and I didn't do so much with Sports of Field, but I also what I'm looking at in the dissertation is hunting's transforming or evolving or changing public culture from the end of World War II up until about the 1990s. And so I looked for any place where hunters are sort of publicly celebrating or articulating, rationalizing, explaining what they do, what it means to them, how they see themselves as hunters, how they identify and understand themselves and what they're doing, and also where they sort of butt up against the non-hunting public and how they define themselves in relation to non-hunters, anti-hunters, etc. And so
focusing on the friction, not internal friction, but the friction or lubrication or whatever, between people who hunt and people who don't, or like the broader culture.
Yeah,
not like conflict within the hunting world about where do we feel, how do we feel about.
No, and I do look at that as well. I look at how you see it in today's letters to the editor, this and that. Somebody says we as sportsmen should do this. We as sportsmen should be on this page.
Yeah.
And there is conflict within these ranks. So what I'm looking at is how hunters have identified over the course of about 50 years, how they've identified in relation to one another and in relation to the non-hunting public.
Gotcha.
And it's sort of a mutually constitutive process in that, the they're not in a vacuum. They're defining themselves in relation to a changing world around them, and they're not just sort of blank slates either, right? If that makes sense. So some of the changing public culture comes from within, and some of it is in response to outside forces as well.
So tell me, like, you guys hate generalizations and stuff like that, I know. Tell me something. Like, tell me something that would surprise me that you found out, or like what in the end wound up being like, what's the what, right?
Well, so there are 5 chapters to the thing. There's 5 chapters and an epilogue, and they all sort of track a different story.
Okay.
Throughout about a 50-year span, so it's not written chronologically.
I got you.
And what might interest you the most, one of the chapters is...
Right now, what interests me the most is what are the 5 chapters?
Oh, so the first chapter looks at hunters and environmental politics from about 1945 to the mid-1970s. And what I do in that is there's sort of this old... paradigm of, we have conservationists from turn of the century, and this is what a sort of an academic historian would tell you, there are conservationists and there are properly modern environmentalists. Mm-hmm. And there's this moment of rupture, whereas, at the turn of the century, you have guys like Gifford Pinchot, Teddy Roosevelt, all these, stalwart heroes of conservation, and they are really dominating environmental policy making in this period. And then in the post-war period, a new set of actors steps in with a new set of values, and they are the driving force behind some of the landmark legislation in the 60s and 70s. Yeah. And so what I try to do in that first chapter is basically say that there's much more continuity than that, and that it makes for an easy story to tell if you say, hunters did this at the turn of the century, and then non-hunters had their moment in the 60s and 70s. And I'm saying, no, look, if you look through the 1940s, 50s, 60s, and 70s, hunters remain a powerful, engaged political bloc that are really driving policymaking at a local and federal level throughout this period. So I'm looking at the ways in which these magazines are...
So it wasn't like the counterculture spawned this sudden group of environmentalists who went out and like rewrote the books.
Yeah, and I mean, if I were to sort of oversimplify what most historians...
I'm not asking you to do that.
But I think that's a good way of sort of summing up or simplifying what a lot of historians who haven't looked at this stuff would tell you, is that there's sort of a counterculture, a new set of values in the 60s and 70s that's really responsible for the environmental legislation and policies that have given us the world that we live in today, essentially. And that their values and their issues and issues of concern supplanted these older issues of concern that guys like Roosevelt are concerned with.
What caused that viewpoint?
Among historians?
Yeah, like why do people think that happened?
Well, I think that in part it comes from a lot of historians, a lot of academics in general study things that they're interested in and concerned with or concerned about. And so a lot of the initial scholarship on this subject was written by people who came of age in the 60s and 70s. Yeah. So, that's sort of how Dan got into environmental history.
But that's the criticism of that generation, is how egocentric that generation was.
Yeah. Yeah, it's this is how history is written, is that, there's sort of a thesis. One group puts out a thesis, they put out an argument, and then other people come revisit that and say, things might have been oversimplified here, they might have been overlooked. And sort of the initial group that makes sense of things and periodizes things and says, this is, modern, quote unquote, modern environmentalists are this, they're X, Y, and Z, they believe A, B, and C. That's how they make sense of the past and of a really messy reality. Yeah. And so they come in and do that initial work. And then what I'm trying to do in my project is say, you've overlooked a much more complex reality. You've overlooked stories that might make it a little more difficult to make sense of what happened in the 60s and 70s, where we get the Clean Water Act, the Clean Air Act, things like that. the National Environmental Protection Act, the Endangered Species Act. So that's sort of what my project is. So that's the first chapter is trying to write sort of a counter narrative of the 20th century environmental movement through the eyes of Field and Stream readers, outdoor life readers.
What's chapter 2?
Chapter 2 looks at the emergence of anti-hunting sentiment in the 1970s and the ways in which anti-hunting advocates try to harness their own agenda to some of these powerful new environmental laws, and how this dynamic reshapes the way that a lot of hunters perceive these laws.
Let me back up for a minute. When did the word? Were there anti-hunters in 1940? I mean, of course they were, but what were they? Like
Bambi's 1942.
Really?
Right. So, but Bambi isn't. Yeah. I mean, Bambi's 1942. One of the things that I do with this is, and opposition to hunting goes back further than that.
Yeah. I mean, you ever read the Old Testament?
Yeah.
Jacob and Esau.
Right. Yeah. And so this is. I mean, there's a huge literature out here, but there's an interesting book, I don't know if you've read it, Daniel Justin Herman's Hunting in the American Imagination. No. One of his arguments is that sort of the early Puritans actually, if they knew that, who would become Americans were a people that prided themselves on their hunting culture, the Puritans would have been really dismayed by that, because hunting is something that you do when you're not working, and you should always be working. And it's something,
right?
And so one of his arguments is that sort of that hunting occupied a different place in the American imagination in colonial times. And what his book does is sort of trace that through. Once the United States is created, then you need some American heroes and heroes that differentiate your culture from that of Europe. And so Americans embrace sort of the Daniel Boone types.
Yeah.
Right. And so that's a really interesting book. You'd really enjoy that one. But anyway, there's always been sort of, hunting has occupied different places in the American imagination over time. And what my project does is sort of track that through the 20th century. So to get back to the question of anti-hunting sentiment, there's opposition to hunting that arises in the 19th century. The SPCA and some of these anti-animal cruelty groups.
Or they were organized then.
Yeah, and their primary consideration in the 19th century was really sort of cruelty to horses, because they're urban-based reformers who are looking at these horses out in New York City, in London, getting whipped, getting knocked around in the street, underfed horses just being put to work, right? And so that's really where this idea of animal cruelty comes into more widespread, I guess. It carries more clout among a wider public, and so really in the late 60s and early 70s is when this stuff comes to a head. When
there became like an anti-hunting movement.
Yeah.
1960s, 1970s.
Yeah, a movement, yeah. There are a number of groups founded in the mid-60s, and one of the reasons for this, and this is what I look at in this chapter, is that some of these laws that are created in the 60s and 70s for purposes unrelated to the anti-hunting agenda are very quickly embraced by anti-hunting advocates in order to secure their own desired outcomes, right? And so,
give me an example. ESA protection.
ESA protection, yeah, that's a good one. I mean, the one that I really focus on in this chapter is the National Environmental Protection Act of 1969, which is signed into law in 1970, and people know NEPA as it's known because it requires environmental impact statements. Right, and so if the federal government is going to do something or fund something, it requires that experts come in and assess what impact this action is going to have on the environment.
Yeah.
Right, and this is something that, if you look back at the pages of Field and Stream and Outdoor Life, one of the more interesting things that I found was that in 1944 or 45, the editor of, I believe it was Arthur Graham, who was the editor of Outdoor Life at the time, is calling for almost this exact law but he's worried about channelization and the construction of huge dams in the post-war era.
You kidding me?
And so he's writing. Yeah,
What year?
And this is like in 1944, 45.
Prophetic, man.
Yeah, and so this is what really fascinates me is you can go back into these magazines, and this is an issue that's still selling war bonds, right? And he's calling for a law, and he uses the words, we need a coordinating law with sharp teeth that will hold government officials accountable for what they do to the natural world.
Did he lose his job?
No.
Was it like someone tried to start a big boycott?
People were on board with this stuff. And what I think is interesting is if you look at these magazines through the 40s, 50s, 60s, into the 70s, a lot of the things that they're calling for, you would associate with sort of cutting edge avant-garde environmentalism, if you consider them in context.
Yeah, no, for sure, man. The fact that someone would have been talking about that then.
Yeah, and he's writing in 44, 45. This law isn't signed. It's signed by President Nixon in 1970, and it's still, at the time of its signing, it's still held as the largest achievement, of the crowning achievement of the environmental movement, right? And if you think about what environmental impact statements require, it's sort of incorporating a new set of values into the policymaking process. It's a big deal. And he's calling for it in 44, 45.
And when it came around, the anti-hunters and the hunters saw some gain, or had the hunters lost interest in it by the 70s?
No, they were still using it and using targeted litigation to pursue their own ends, right? To pursue. They used it a lot. Different sportsmen's groups used environmental impact statements to challenge resource extraction, channelization of waterways, things like that. And it's very much celebrated in the pages of these magazines when this law is enacted. But very quickly, what you see are that anti-hunting groups are using lawsuits and making claims under NEPA. They're saying the environmental impact statement for this hunting season didn't consider this alternative. And essentially what an environmental impact statement does is it asks that somebody sit down and say, if we do A, 1, 2, 3 will happen. If we do B, 4, 5, 6 will happen. And so it's sort of this systematic accounting of what might happen through these various policies.
So they run an environmental impact statement on a proposed hunting season?
That's what the anti-hunting activists demanded that they do in the 1960s or in the 1970s.
Oh, I see.
And they start challenging.
Just try to make it onerous. Try to make it difficult to make hunting seasons. So you slow things down, right? You slow things down, and sort of the real fear, and you see this in the magazine. Some of these writers are saying, well, if they challenge Pittman-Robertson with the Pittman-Robertson Act of 1937, which is the act that places an excise tax on firearms and sporting equipment, et cetera, that funds much of the wildlife management in this country. The fear is that research, habitat improvement,
all that stuff, right? I mean, it's responsible for the sort of miraculous recovery of all the wild game species in this country between 1930 and 1970 when we're talking about. I mean, in 1930, there's like 500,000 deer. In 1970, there's 14 million. In 1930, there's just a handful of antelope.
2 turkeys, one pregnant.
Turkeys are a great example. Antelope populations increased something like 14 times in this period of 40 years. So it's really Pittman-Robertson and these funding structures that are built around this model of consumptive use and hunting. That's sort of the backbone of wildlife management in this country. And hunters today will tell you that with great pride, right? And you see that all the time. And actually, the fear among a lot of these writers in the 70s is that Pittman-Robertson will be challenged under NEPA, and it actually is. There are lawsuits filed, and there's a lot of sort of behind-the-scenes wrangling. But there are wildlife officials, government administrators.
That they're saying you should do an environmental impact statement on the Pittman-Robertson.
And what they're asking for is that there would have to be an accounting for every single thing that Pittman-Robertson dollars do, which is just totally unmanageable.
So you want to put in like a water tank somewhere, and you'd have to
exactly. You'd have to exactly. And so this is this is really a moment of crisis. And you'll see, if you go back and read through these magazines, you can see this all unfolding. And so in this chapter, I look at the way, when anti-hunters harness environmental laws to their own agenda, it changes the ways in which hunters perceive environmental laws. And so this is one of the questions that
why so many hunters now seem like burdened or annoyed by the Endangered Species Act.
Yeah, and they're all, the Endangered Species Act is used a lot by anti-hunters as sort of a marketing tool, essentially. I mean, it has great cultural cachet in the 1970s. People have lunch boxes and stuff with charismatic megafauna, and politicians are going out waving. When the when the Endangered Species Act is passed, it's wildly popular. It's a wildly popular piece of legislation at a moment in which faith in government is declining precipitously, right, in the early mid 1970s. And so this is one that lawmakers really hang their hat on. We're doing what the people want. But very quickly anti-hunting advocates use claims revolving, using this language. They're deploying this language of endangered species to target hunters and blame hunters for environmental degradation.
Gotcha. And
so, again, the concept of endangered species is sort of weaponized. And in a large part what this chapter does is explores the polarization that we see between people who identify as environmentalists and people who identify as hunters. Yeah. And I know this is a gross, oversimplification of who hunters are today, right? But I think if you talk to a lot of people, the words environmentalists and hunters, they're not often used.
No, but
together,
that's why we use the word. That's why I say I'm a conservationist.
Exactly,
which is a loaded term.
You don't want the E word.
I use it too. I always say conservationist, but now and then I just also say, I'll just say like, well, no, I'm an environmentalist.
Yeah.
So up until some point in the 70s, hunters said, I'm an environmentalist.
But they weren't using. When did people start using that term?
They were using. A lot of them were using the terms interchangeably, right? It's not as if the term conservationist all of a sudden supplanted the term environmentalist in these magazines in the 1970s. But one of the interesting things that you'll see is in the 60s and 70s, you'll see articles saying, covering the development of outdoor education programs at colleges and taking sort of these long-haired hippie types into the woods and teaching them about, camping and hiking and this and that. And the readers of these magazines are saying, this is great. We need these people on our side.
Was that right?
Oh, yeah.
God, that rings a bell. Just republish all those articles now.
Yeah. No, and so this is, it sort of echoes to, contemporary development sort of echo what I see in these sources from 40 years ago.
Oh, that's amazing. All right, Chapter 3.
Chapter 3.
Are we cool to leave Chapter 2 for a minute?
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah. Unless you feel like we missed the point.
No. That's sort of what I'm doing. That's sort of what I look at is this polarization and the changing politics of the word sort of environmentalism in the hunting community.
Now, if you really want to act like you're pissed off at someone, like you'd be like a tree hugger,
right?
But dude, I'm prone to hug a tree now and then, man.
Yeah.
Especially if I'm trying to climb it. But, I want to tell you something real quick. The one note I had ahead of talking to you is to tell you the story. When I was in high school, I graduated from high school in 1992. Okay. I grew up in Western Michigan. In 1991 or 1992, I can't remember, me and the guys I hung out with, largely as a joke, but kind of not, we started a group called HATE. Hunters Against Teenage Environmentalists. And we had T-shirts and wild game dinners, and we did like a canned goods drive as a fundraiser.
Yeah.
Because we had never even heard the word environmentalist. Then all of a sudden it was there, and we thought that, like, we were under the impression that an environmentalist, that meant anti-hunter.
Yeah, and
because there was a school group, these kids in school who were into charismatic megafauna, dolphins and stuff, who had a very strong anti-hunting bent, started like an environmental group, but all they talked about was anti-hunting. Like, as in their mind, that's what the debate was. right? Their mind was like pitted a bit like, oh yeah, you're an environmentalist? Oh, I hate hunting too, right? Was their tone, okay?
Right.
Many years ago. So we started hate. We had T-shirts that said hate, and off it was Hunters Against Teenage Environmentalists. Like I said, it's a joke. We'd have wild game dinners.
Yeah.
And like, it was only years later that I realized that that's not what that meant.
Yeah, I mean, that's a pretty common misconception. I think a lot of people associate the term environmentalist with the politics of anti-hunting.
One of my buddies from Hate just got hold of me and sent me, I'd lost my T-shirt. He sent me his old T-shirt.
Oh, nice.
Which I hung in my closet in a safe place. My wife's like, best not to share that one on social media.
Yeah.
But anyhow, explain chapter 3 to me.
Chapter 3 looks
They don't get less interesting, do they?
No.
That's a writer's mistake, man, to put all the good stuff in the front, you know?
Yeah, no, it's, I wrote it backwards. So I wrote the first chapter last.
Okay.
And it was a sprint to the finish, so I was just kind of hammering it out. But chapter 3 looks at gun control and the politics of gun control in the pages of these magazines and how that conversation changes over time.
When did the conversation start? In a way that we'd recognize it today.
I think the origins of the modern Second Amendment debate are in the 1960s, and 1968 is the Gun Control Act of 1968 is sort of the foundational piece of the modern regulatory framework.
Gotcha.
Right. And
that's when the debate that we would recognize now.
Well, the debate changes in the 70s. And this is what that chapter looks at. And it really looks at it. I don't do a really detailed analysis of, this proposed bill did this proposed bill did that. I look at more popular perception of this debate. And in the pages of these magazines, when hunters say, we as hunters have a stake in this question, where do we fall? On what side are we? That the answer to that is in this sort of constant negotiation through the 70s, and this conversation is also unfolding in relation to questions about environmental protection.
Really?
Yeah, and well, I mean, by the 80s, you see guys writing into these magazines saying, and this will sound familiar to a lot of your listeners today. We vote Democratic and we lose our guns to hunt with, or we vote Republican and we lose our lands to hunt on.
Dude, I always say the same thing.
This is something that you I mean, there's a letter to the editor that says that exact that has that exact phrase in it from I think it's 1980 or 1984. I think it's probably in the lead up to the 84 election.
Yeah.
After the initial Sagebrush Rebellion has fizzled out. But this is one of sort of my the central assumptions of this project is that it's very hard for people to think about one question at a time, right? As sort of political animals, all of these things are constantly in flux in relation to one another. And so political behavior isn't just, you're not presented with sort of an ideal ticket. And these tickets change over time. And as a result, people have to ask themselves questions. What do I believe in at this moment? Where do my loyalties lie, et cetera, et cetera? And so that chapter 3 looks at the emergence of the modern Second Amendment debate, how it changes in the 70s, and ultimately how sportsmen react to this new point of fracture in American political life.
And how did they react?
I think without getting too detailed here, in the late 1960s and early 1970s, it was far more common to see sportsmen say, we occupy sort of a position of influence in this debate because we have a legitimate purpose. And these are the words that they're using, they're not mine, but we have a legitimate purpose for these firearms. Yeah. And so we should use our position of influence in order to come up with reasonable solutions. And it's in the late 1960s and early 1970s, you see sort of the larger, and there's obviously exceptions to this. It's very much in debate, but there's a large element calling for a position of moderation on these issues. The debate becomes much more polarized in the mid 70s, 1974, 1975 in particular, and there are some, there are a number of other developments, but increasingly the position of sort of uncompromising hardline opposition to new firearm regulation becomes a more popular opinion as expressed in these magazines.
Well, there had to be new firearms. Like when I look at firearm issues now, it so much has to do with, you don't hear the word very often, but a lot of it has to do with technology. We're always grappling with, when I say us, the American public, whatever side of this issue you're on, we're always grappling with, well, what are we going to do about what you might consider to be emerging technologies?
Right.
You know?
Right.
Availability on the marketplace of things that weren't available on the marketplace before. So is what you're talking about, was that driven by availability of new weapons classes, or was it just like...
Well, in the mid 1970s, the concern is pistols that are called "quote unquote" Saturday night specials.
Oh,
right.
Okay,
And the debate,
just stuff you don't even think about now.
The debate sort of echoes what you hear about "quote unquote" assault rifles today. Right. People are arguing this is an arbitrary categorization that a gun of another type could be equally as harmful or injurious, whatever.
Yeah, I wasn't thinking about that, like just like snub nose pistols.
Yeah, but it's a big. I mean, and when you think about it, it's actually a pretty mainstream debate. I mean, there's a cover of Field and Stream called Saturday Night. The title of the feature piece is Saturday Night Special: The Real Issue, and it's got this big smoking handgun on the cover. It's this illustration, and the author of the piece, Bob Brister, I believe, is the author of the piece. He essentially writes, we have no use for these, and as gun owners, we shouldn't be lumped in with, street thugs and this and that, and these criminals. And
that was the editorial stance of the magazine.
So there was a big blowback to that.
Oh yeah,
and this is part of what I look at is the politics of, there's this larger suspicion at the time too. CBS owns Field and Stream. And CBS puts out
at the time,
yeah, and they put out some really sort of nasty anti-hunting hit pieces as documentaries on TV. The Guns of Autumn is one, and so readers, there are a lot of letters to the editor, and I also looked at the personal papers of writers and editors for these magazines, and you'll see that they're getting mail saying, are you guys in control of your magazine, or is it the guys up at CBS?
Oh, yeah.
And so so Field and Stream has to sort of steal its resolve essentially, and really come out as we are on the sportsman's side in this one, and they adopt a more hardline position editorially.
Is that right?
Oh yeah, this is at the time when suspicion of the media becomes more popular in American life.
You're familiar with the story of Jim Zumbo?
Oh yeah. No, it's
like very, very, very similar.
Exactly, it's very similar to that. And so this is what
I'm not familiar.
Okay,
you're not?
No.
So, oh my God! I mean, it's such a
Andy.
No.
You know the name Jim Zumbo?
Sure.
Okay. Venerable, long time done a lot for hunting. Long time gun writer, long time hunting writer. He. Right when blogging kind of started, he had done a blog entry where he was blogging, I believe from Wyoming, had been out hunting coyotes, and mentions in his blog, let me back up and say, this guy I think he'd been a staffer at Outdoor Life for 25 years, was sponsored by all the big players, okay, had his own like jerky, his own everything. Right? I mean, he was like the name. He's like the Bill Dance of hunting. And shared with his blog readers his opinion that, or he relates a story how he was hunting coyotes with some guys who were telling him how guys have started hunting coyotes with ARs. And he says, hunters have no business using these terrorist guns. I say ban them from the woods right now. Now, immediately, I mean, his show, all his sponsorships, his position at the like everything was immediately stripped through public outrage. And he later attempted a redact, like, how's he say that word?
Redacted?
He later tried to redact, and he said that he had been out in the wind all day and it had been a long day and was very tired and didn't mean what he said. And that didn't work. And later he went through a very public sort of, he like enlisted himself sort of in a re-education camp, you know, in a very public way, and went hunting with the guns that he had said he was opposed to, and did a lot of steps to try to, you know, recuperate. And it was like, everything about it was sad. Everything about it was sad. Clearly, you know, it was kind of, in one way, it was kind of the beginning of just like that. Like, here's a guy who'd always gone through like an editorial process, right? And it always, you know, you write something, you write another draft, right? And that kind of stuff like gives you time to sort of like filter out like what you're thinking and what you're saying. You know, like, what do you really believe? Like, I'll get, like, everyone has written a really nasty email at 11 at night, right? And then if you have the wherewithal to not hit send at 8 in the morning, you'd be like, well, you know, I'm not going to quite put it that way. I'm going to put it a different way. But he didn't. He just put this out there, like, ban them, you know, and people took him very literally. Like, so it was never really clear, like, what he, I mean, it was clear, like, he said what he said, right? But you don't know, like, had he gone through his normal thinking on it, you know, and talked to his buddies, right? And his buddies, he said, well, you know, think about it this way, Jim, you're not looking at it this way or whatever, and you think about the ramifications of what you're saying. But it was just like, it was just painful. I mean, this guy had really, in many ways, devoted his life to the promotion of hunting, you know, and was just just eviscerated, and just like people who never heard of Jim Zumbo on whatever morning that was, on Tuesday were feigning just the biggest disappointment. You know what I mean? It was like,
it was quick.
He became famous in a crowd that he would never been famous with, you know? It was just that was sad. It was sad watching him have to sort of like I always thought of when the communists like rolled into Saigon and put millions of people in re-education camps. It was like him having to go to re-education camp because he's just like an old guy. And then out of that came the term like a FUD, right? A FUD. I don't know. A FUD is a dude. I've been accused of being a FUD. A FUD is a guy who looks at firearm issues through the lens of a hunter.
Yeah.
Because like Elmer Fudd, I guess he's got a shitty gun. I don't know. So it'd be like, you're like a FUD if you view, because in all honesty, the Second Amendment has no mention of hunting. Like, I'll always have people say like, oh yeah, well, you should be able to have guns because you hunt. Right. I'm like, wow, you know, in some respect, maybe I'm glad you feel that way, because at least you allow that there is a reason to have guns, like in your mind, like it's not like a dead end deal. But the framers of the Constitution and the Second Amendment were not thinking about a guy's right to go out and shoot squirrels. Right. It like wasn't what they were trying to protect. If it was, they would have said something like that. It was not on their mind. So that's not like a plausible argument. But the whole thing was sad. The whole thing was sad. Read up on I wrote a thing in Salon about Jim Zumbo. When it was just like, I just wish he had sat on what he said and thought about it for a couple days. Because I feel, having never met the guy, I feel that he would have, like, whatever, a couple days later, he'd have been like, well, you know, I don't like it. Like, there's what, like, let's think about the message we're sending. He would have, like, he wouldn't have went out and said, like, let's ban him now. I think it was just, I don't think it's what he would have, I don't think it's what he meant. Or I don't think it's what he would have said had he thought about it longer. And I think that he got so just like it was just watching like a nice old man just get beat to death on the curb. But a lot of people look at it like a great victory. Great victory. And it kind of sent a message like, don't mess with us. You know, and I think that, you know, the message resonated. But anyhow, it's just funny. Like when you talk about that story, it's like that story plays out now and then.
Yeah, I mean,
know?
a lot of what I see in these magazines 30, 40, 50 years ago, they echo events and developments that I remember from my own time in my lifetime reading these as a reader, right, and not as a researcher. So that was really interesting to see. I mean, the blowback from that wasn't, you know, it wasn't this swift, and I think technology tightens that feedback loop.
People
right?
were just falling in love. People were falling in love with the web, man.
But you absolutely get, you absolutely would see letters to the editor from the mid 1970s saying, who's in control of the editorial position of this magazine? Is it you guys? Or can we trust you? Or is CBS dictating the content here?
Did another editor recently publish a anti-gun letter to the editor and lost his job?
I'm not sure.
Yeah, I can't remember where.
Yeah.
I think he published. Just telling you, listeners, I could be messing this up. I don't think I am. If I'm messing it up, I'm not messing up the main gist. I'm messing up a detail. An editor, I believe, published a anti-gun, like a gun editor at a gun magazine, published an anti-gun letter to the editor and lost his position. Which is like which is weirder than the Zumbo thing. Weirder because it's sort of like it was almost like he was sort of using the magazine as sort of like a place for debate and a place where debate wasn't welcome. And it is. It's like, that's a tricky thing. I would never do like an episode of my show. Well, I would remember like this week on MeatEater, we're not going hunting.
Right.
We're going to an anti-hunting convention.
Right.
You know what I mean? It would be like, it'd be weird.
Well, what's funny though, and this is one of the larger takeaways from the project that I see over in terms of measuring sort of the larger change over time, is that hunting's public culture, I feel, in the 1950s and 1960s, before you have these larger public challenges to hunting, it's a public culture that's much more open to debate. I mean, in Outdoor Life publishes in 54 maybe, or maybe this is 48. They publish an article called "Why I Gave Up Hunting," and they say this guy makes it. We're not saying we're on board with this, but he makes a compelling case, and we thought that this voice should be heard.
Had he seen something he didn't want to see?
I mean, he basically just described this as he sort of woke up one day. The author of the piece, I'm not sure I'm going to remember the author's name, but basically says, I woke up one day and sort of realized that what I was doing was sort of indulging a more primitive side of me that
Is that right?
and they publish it, right? And you can't imagine that
You
being
could get that
published
story.
today.
You could get it published, but it wouldn't be published in Field and Stream or Outdoor Life.
Yeah, right, exactly. And so and you can sort of be skeptical and say they're just publishing that piece, they're fanning the flames and sort of drawing lines in the sand. But I really do, you look at there's debate about the morality of hunting in the 40s and 50s and early 60s before the anti-hunting movement really gains traction. But the debate is much more. I don't know what the right word to use. I mean, there's a spirit of sort of honest consideration of other viewpoints that you don't see as much in contemporary culture.
Well, I would argue that I'm going to say we when I mean like the hunting community who feels the compulsion to engage in the debate about hunting. Right, a lot of people just hunt, right?
Right.
Like my brothers, they just hunt.
I mean,
my brothers, they hunt.
When you talk about,
they don't they don't. It's just not what they're doing. Right, they're not like sitting talking to someone about it right now. They hunt all the damn time, but they're talking about something else.
Right.
So, anyways, those of us who, you're right, grapple with this stuff verbally with other people, we're not like talking right now. The broader hunting community isn't talking right now about like. So much like to hunt or not to hunt, but we are having very spirited, very divisive debates about high fence, right?
Yeah.
About long-range shooting, long-range technologies.
Yeah.
The drone thing, I thought was going to become big, but so many states are getting out ahead of it so quickly that it might not become an issue. Laser range finders, right? Souped up compound bows. It's like we're always sort of, there is still that debate because I can't think of a hunting writer or a shooting magazine editor who hasn't weighed in on what's too far of a shot.
But I think too that there's another side to these conversations. There's a very vocal element of the hunting public today that says hunters shouldn't be criticizing other hunters.
Yeah,
right.
I get it all the time, man.
And I think that's a product of this cultural shift that I track in the dissertation of the 60s, 70s, primarily the 70s is sort of my big pivotal decade. But I think this, us hunters have our backs to the wall. We don't need to be debating the ethics of what the guy next to you is doing. And I think that is an unhealthy. I think that's
yeah. Well, if that guy's pulling the plug, the plug on the boat,
yeah,
like, well, no, we're all on this boat together. But yeah, but that son of a bitch just cut a hole through the bottom of it.
And there's all kinds. I
want
to
get on chapter 4, but
chapter 4.
Like, if you got any concluding thoughts about 3, lay it on. I want to make sure to cover your whole deal.
All right, yeah.
Before we run out of
chapter
time.
4. Chapter 4 was the one I was going to begin with because chapter 4 tracks the changing culture of wild game consumption from 1945 to 1990, and
that's pretty interesting.
And the way in which the changing, sort of how the changing ways in which hunters use the meat that they kill, that they harvest, whatever, how that changes how they imagine what they're doing. Right?
Yeah.
So if you can't fill the freezer for the winter to feed your family all year because you don't own a freezer because it's 1945, 1946, what are you doing, right?
The ice box.
And I mean, refrigerators are far more widespread in the immediate post-war period, but freezer ownership doesn't really take off until the mid-60s.
God, I never thought about that.
I mean,
you know what occurred to me
sportsmen are
recently
early
that's similar to
adopters.
that?
Yeah.
Daniel Boone, okay, on up Jim Bridger, Jed Smith. They did all that shit without flashlights, man. When it got dark, it was dark.
Yeah.
You could do some shit with a candle or a fire, but they did it without flashlights. Now, you go out and spend a couple weeks in the woods with no flashlight. And I'm not talking about Alaska in July.
Right.
But, like, spend a couple weeks and realize how much stuff you get done under artificial illumination.
Yeah.
Man. And how much, like, really important stuff happens under artificial illumination. Imagine, like, it's like one day I was occurring to me, like, wow, man, when it got dark, it was dark.
Yeah.
But anyhow, no refrigerator. Like, what did they say when they had no fridge or no freezer?
Well, it's hard to, I mean, it's hard to generalize, right? But one of the things that what struck, and this wasn't initially a chapter in the project, but as I'm reading through these magazines, and especially local newspaper columns, I kept running into these anecdotes about, people only eat things they shoot because they want an excuse to shoot another, something like that.
Yeah.
Whereas I think that the ethics,
which people still say that.
Well, yeah, but I think that obviously there are exceptions, but I think that for the most part, what I saw over the several decade-long period is a changing, a much more widespread adoption of the ethics of consuming what you kill, right? And obviously people have consumed what they kill since the dawn of time, right? But there's certain...
It's why people got into hunting, you know?
Yeah, it is, right? But if you look at like the late 1940s and early 1950s, I mean, one of the things that I never really thought about before I got into the project is hunting became much more popular in the immediate post-war decade. We often think about hunting as sort of this declension. You know, at one point in history, all people hunted to live, and that number has just been steadily declining. But hunting, sort of like religiosity, there were moments of revival, right?
Oh yeah, it got huge, man. Yeah, this whole generation, like that's when my dad started. My dad started getting serious about big game hunting immediately after World War II, and he's like, there was a lot of guys around who were used to traveling around, used to hanging out with other guys, having a good time. They were stir crazy.
Right.
Like they didn't want to get into the thing. The Hells Angels came out at the same time. My dad like cruised around with buddies of his, and they hunted because they were out of their mind.
I mean, it's a phenomenon. Yeah. I mean, it's a post-war phenomenon. So in 1940, there's like 7 million something hunting licenses sold, and by 1950, it's like 14 million. It nearly doubles in a
But think
decade.
how old those guys were too.
Right.
It's like now the average hunter's what, like in his late 40s or 50s or something like that. I mean, those guys are 21, 22 years old.
And so and what's funny, I mean, the way that you phrase that, there's an editorial in Outdoor Life before the end of the war, and the author is escaping me at the moment, but he writes, "You can't introduce millions of young men to the joys of firearms and living in the woods and expect them to just give it up, at the drop of a hat," right?
I remember a neighbor down the road of ours who was a pilot, like flew a plane in World War II. And he later talked about getting home from World War II and asked him kind of like the things he did for a while. And he said, I enrolled, like he had the GI Bill. I enrolled in school, sat there for a couple of days, and just realized after what I just did for 2 years, you've got to be kidding me that I'm going to sit in this chair.
Yeah. Yeah.
There's just no way.
And so this is, I mean, it's a new passion for a lot of young men in this period. And if you think about the numbers of wildlife that existed in the 1930s, prior to Pittman Robertson, prior to this sort of rebounding of all these wild game populations, you think about how that changed sort of the culture of hunting, right? If there aren't any deer in your backyard to shoot, sort of what it means to drive to the North Woods, get your deer, and come back home. You're not taking, your little kid out on the weekend and going hunting with them, right? It's your war buddies. You're taking
you get your red and black checkered outfit on and go over to the North Woods, man.
But with the novelty of this behavior for a lot of these guys, there are some complications. Rates of accidental shooting skyrocket in the late 1940s and early 1950s.
That's when my dad got shot.
Oh yeah?
Yeah, hunting accident.
Yeah. I mean, this is a huge. The Sports Illustrated, I think in like the 1951 or 1952, predicted that more hunters would get shot that year than like moose, bighorn, wild goat, and they list basically everything other than deer. They said more American men are going to get shot in this hunting season than all of these species of big game combined.
My old man loved the irony of the fact that he was on the Anzio beachhead invasion. Okay, fought all through the Italian peninsula, marched all the way to France, and was injured, but never by a bullet, never scratched by a bullet, and came home and they were hunting rabbits and a guy shot him in the foot with a 12-gauge shotgun at point blank range.
Yeah.
It's just like, he's like, how could that be?
I mean, it was a common experience, relatively speaking.
But get me into the like. Okay, how are they dealing? What before when these guys all start hunting deer? They don't have freezers. They're not like seasoned woodsmen.
Yeah.
Who know how to smoke hams and know how to do like primitive, old school meat preservation techniques. What'd you just get a deer and party with it and eat it in a week?
Well, that's. I mean, I found a lot of references to guys running around town trying to hand meat off to neighbors and this and that, right? Trying to get rid of the thing before it's spoiled. And there, you could rent freezer space. And sportsmen were earlier adopters of this technology, the freezers, than other Americans. And freezer companies actually, you'll see these advertisements in the late 1940s, early 1950s, when these freezer manufacturers are starting to really push this technology. They're saying, hey, imagine eating year-round what you killed this fall.
Oh, is that right?
Yeah, and there are actually laws on the books in the late 1940s. One of the ways in which some of the early wildlife regulations prohibit or intended to curtail poaching was by criminalizing possession of wild game within X number of days after the end of the season. And in some states, I think it was like 5 or 6 states, when the season ended, you can't have any wild game in your house.
Is that right?
Yeah. And so there,
because the assumption was if you have it,
you probably shot it last week.
Just shot it.
Yeah. Why would you have a tenderloin from whitetail you shot 6 months ago, something like that, as so many people do today. Man, that's interesting. In these magazines, if you look at these magazines in the late 1940s, some of these editors are saying we need to reinvent these laws, because as more and more sportsmen buy freezers and have the means to preserve wild game year round, these laws are actually going to penalize law-abiding sportsmen, or they're going to penalize sportsmen who want to conserve this meat and use it to feed their family.
Yep.
And so, I mean, another side story, or another sort of thing that you'll see in these magazines again and again, and also in newspapers, these accounts, people sort of openly acknowledging that most, and you'll see these words, and so it's not my sort of me poking at people in the past, but you'll see these words again and again. Most of the wild game in this country is wasted. You'll see that. I mean, you'll see it in anywhere from Ladies' Home Journal to Field and Stream to Outdoor Life. It's sort of this open, ugly secret.
Well, yeah,
and it's not much of a secret.
I wouldn't say most,
right,
but a hell of a lot of it is today.
Well, yeah, I mean, but I think back then, the difference is back then, there wasn't a sort of the ethical consideration of wasting what you kill wasn't nearly as prominent on the pages of these magazines. And that really
is it because they didn't have an awareness of finiteness, or is it something different?
Well, it's a point of concern, I think, for a lot of wildlife officials and administrators who are tasked with conserving this resource, and those are sort of the terms that they view it in. And so in the 1960s, you see state fish and game departments putting out cookbooks and putting out guides on how to and this is something that agricultural extension services throughout the country had been doing, piecemeal. But it really takes off in the 60s, especially as freezers become more available, and then especially once hunting comes under pressure from anti-hunting activists who are saying you're doing this, just to serve some kind of bloodlust or this or that. It's a wasteful, destructive practice. Increasingly, hunters are defending their pastime by highlighting that they're using this as a means to feed their family.
Yeah.
And there's a huge social scientific literature from the 1970s where there are public opinion polls of the general public, not just hunters and anti-hunters, but of the non-hunting sort of disinterested public, right? And the approval figures of hunting are much, much higher, as they are today, when you emphasize the eating, the consumptive aspect of it, right?
Yeah.
Eating what you kill. And so that in the 70s, this really takes off. And I also tie it in or dovetail it with the economic misfortune of a lot of the country during this period. Like if you think about Michigan, deindustrialization, economic stagnation, you see in the sources, you'll see in magazine articles that, verbatim, deer hunting in the Northwoods this year took on a new level of significance.
Is that right?
As out of work, as laid off auto workers are trying to figure out a way to provide for their families.
We had that a few years ago.
Mm-hmm.
It was announced, and to much fanfare, that there had been a slight uptick in license sales. People were very excited about it, and many people interpreted those numbers. And one interpretation you kept seeing again and again was it was contemporaneous with economic crash, and then you had a lot of dudes who had a lot of time on their hands and did a lot of hunting those couple of years.
Yeah, I mean, and the people that really some of the people that were hit the hardest by the economic stagnation in the 1970s were blue collar, middle class breadwinners in the upper Rust Belt, Michigan. You think about a strong deer hunting culture, right? And so, in that context, this behavior, this practice takes on a new significance. This is how, and you'll see this again and again if you look at local newspapers like Youngstown, Ohio, places like that. There's a story, a local interest story come Christmas time about an out of work guy who went out and fed his family for the winter, with a deer or two.
Filled the old freezer.
And it becomes sort of this trope that you just don't really see. And it's not to say that people didn't consume what they killed in the 40s and 50s, but it resonates in new ways in the imagination in these other contexts.
Yeah. Okay, hit me with chapter 5.
Chapter 5.
Where are we at with time, Yanni?
Yeah.
How long have we been talking?
Probably overboard.
We're getting there, but no, I think we can finish up chapter 5.
Chapter 5 is quick.
Give some final thoughts.
Sure. Yeah, chapter 5. Chapter 5 looks at the ways in which the hunting in American life is increasingly debated with rights-based claims in the 1970s, 1980s, and 1990s. You know, people claiming I have a right to hunt.
Okay.
And conversely, I'll look at the politics of tribal hunting and fishing rights, because the two unfold simultaneously.
Yeah.
And I really sort of tell the story of obviously people have claimed that their rights to hunt dating back much longer, right? Further back than this period that I'm considering. But
yeah, Daniel Boone had no right to be doing what he was doing. What he was doing was on land claimed by the British Crown, and he was like trespassing not only on a Native American land, he was trespassing on the land claimed by another country.
Yeah. So one of the interesting things that I discovered in my research was this article from like a law review in the 1930s, and this guy's making mention of the fact that Pennsylvania at the time of the Constitutional Convention had a pretty radical democratic, small d democratic political culture, and in Pennsylvania, I'm 90% certain that it's Pennsylvania, and I'm also 90% certain that nobody else is going to call me out on this one. But I think Pennsylvania suggested incorporating into the Bill of Rights a right to hunt on all unoccupied lands within the new nation.
Man.
And it was jettisoned.
Really?
Yeah.
Man, that would have been nice.
Yeah, so that was a
dude, I'd be hitting Yellowstone hard this fall, man.
But yeah, so this guy, like in the 1930s, apparently had dug up some old transcript of the Philadelphia delegation or something like that when they're meeting to debate the ratification of the Constitution. Anyway, so I look at the ways in which and part of it stems from the rise of new anti-hunting strategies, like folks showing up in the woods trying to disrupt hunts, and hunters making claims, I have a right to be here, this is illegal.
Yeah, now it's like a lot of states
right.
have ratified hunter harassment laws.
Yeah, this is the sort of the origins of the modern debate over hunter harassment laws, which is what I look at. I have a right to hunt. I'm doing something lawful, authorized by the state, and my rights are being infringed upon by these folks.
It's kind of you probably know better, but it's like an implied right. Be like to say like, because people always talk about the right to privacy, the Constitution,
right?
There is no. It's an interpretation, right? There's no one.
Yeah.
The Constitution says you have the right to privacy,
right?
Which is like a thing where like we accept that's implied. This sort of idea of the right to privacy. So when people talk about you have a right to hunt, it kind of winds up. It's like you have like an implied right. There's like a hereditary cultural thing enabling you to hunt.
Yeah,
and then it's interesting to see like the hunter harassment stuff was almost kind of a step in the direction of saying like, well, at least have the right to hunt without you messing with me.
Yeah, and the debate over these hunter harassment laws centers around competing rights claims, because the anti-hunting activists, advocates, whatever you want to call them, argue that these laws are infringing my right to protest or to free speech or whatever you want to call it, right? And so ultimately, sort of the stakes of this hunting and anti-hunting debate are amplified by the arena in which it's taking place, or the language in which it's taking place of rights claims, rights-based claims, which are pretty powerful claims in American political culture, especially in the second half of the 20th century, following all of the big social movements, the civil rights movement of the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, whatever. So the fact that this is a language that's being adopted and appropriated in order to engage in this contest over the ethics of hunting, the morality of hunting, heightens the sort of emotional stakes that people have in it. And so that's that chapter. And then the epilogue. The epilogue looks at, and just really briefly, looks at this debate over public lands that, is around the late 19th century, early 20th century, rears its head again in the 80s and seems to be rearing its head again.
Oh, my God. I hope it's just like...
And so, so that chapter sort of sketches out the role that the hunting public has played in this debate. and it's a pretty powerful role.
Dude, man, I hope that in 20 years you can write another dissertation about how this whole anti-public land thing got just squashed by hunters in the 2016, 2015 era.
Well, if I'm writing another dissertation in 20 years, I've made
screwed.
a series of terrible mistakes.
Oh, which leads me to the last thing I wanted to ask you. This isn't my concluding thought. What do you got to do now? You got to get the thing published in like a major...
Yeah, so I mean,
what do you got to do?
I'm sort of catching my breath, and it was, like I said, it was kind of a sprint to the finish there to get wrapped up, and I'm sort of thinking about publication options and thinking about publishers and
like academic type publishers.
Well, I think there's a popular audience for it. So at the moment, I submit
I'd say so.
Yeah,
I'm not saying it needs to be academic. I mean, to make it be a dissertation. Let's say Scribner publishes it.
Yeah.
Does that still count?
Yeah.
Oh, okay. I don't know if it had to be like it had to go through the academic review process.
Scribner publishes it. Yeah.
But it doesn't have to go. So it doesn't have to go through like the peer review process.
No. So what happens is after you write the dissertation, you submit it to a committee of examiners, and they read it, and they're ultimately the arbiters of whether or not this constitutes an original, valuable contribution to the literature. And so Dan was, as my advisor, was the head of that committee, and then I had 5 other professors of history and a professor of environmental studies who read the thing, and we sat down and you defend. It's a defense, so they sit down and ask you, why did you do it this way? What are you missing here? It's as I read this, I would have done this way, and you answer and address their concerns as best you can, and then you're asked to leave the room, and they ultimately come back and say, you either passed it or you didn't. So
and what happened?
Well, I passed. That's why I'm sitting here.
So now that you've done that, you can take any publication venue you want.
Yeah, it's mine. You submit it to an online database.
Okay.
But you can put a hold on it for several years as you're working out how exactly you want to publish it.
Gotcha.
And ideally, you publish it with a press that'll give you the widest audience possible.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
So you don't want to send it to some...
Dude, I don't even want you to kind of think I was suggesting that it wasn't for that.
Sure,
I just thought that because you're involved in this process that you have to stay within that world.
No.
So people will publish a dissertation as a popular book.
Typically not, because most dissertations are written in a...
like heavily footnoted in a way that's never going to...
They're not written in a literary style that people are going to... They're not accessible because they're written for an academic audience to sort of show your chops, test your, show your mettle to an academic audience.
But you'd have to go in and douche it up, right? And take out all, like, de-footnote it and citations and present all that in a different way.
Yeah, I mean, it's up to the publisher. It's up to the press how they want to do it. I mean, I wrote it in such a way that, I mean, a lot of people, they write 1,000-page dissertations and they have to chop it down to like a 200-page book manuscript.
Yeah, that's what I'm wondering.
And so I approached it. I tried to save myself some work on the back end by keeping it as tight as I could as I wrote it. So
my concluding thought is, I don't want to ask you, like, there's a lot of unknowns. My concluding thought is I hope that this work that this work becomes available for people to look at.
Yeah.
And I don't mean like them going in, like I hope it's like published.
Yeah,
right?
no, that's
where they're not going on a JSTOR trying to buy your dissertation for $20 or something.
Yeah, no, that's the hope, that's the goal. And yeah, I just finished about a month or so ago, and I got a lot of balls in the air right now. And
are you going to go work at a university?
At the moment, I'm teaching online and for a university, and sort of figuring out the next step. I mean, I'm interested in teaching. I love teaching. I'm not sure if I want to necessarily go through the academic tenure track job market. I'm interested in also finding employment in conservation and sort of working towards bringing groups together, resolving some of the issues that I've tracked as they emerged in the 1960s, 1970s. So,
well, there you have it, ladies and gentlemen. Call this man up and give him a job. How much money do you make? No, I'm joking.
Oh, yeah. I just came off a salary as a teaching assistant, so anything
listen, you're going to get this guy cheap. Anything sounds good to this guy.
Yeah.
Yanni, you got any concluding thoughts?
Too many, really, for the time I have. Congratulations, first off, for getting that done.
Thank
I know
you.
It's quite the project.
That's gotta feel good, yeah.
It's quite the dragon to slay, as you like to say. Yeah, man. I hope that your work opens up some discussion. I think it's important to know for everybody. It's important to know your history and where you come from, and not only your family history, but now us as hunters. And it's some interesting stuff that you've looked at and shared. So, yeah, hopefully it opens up discussion.
Yeah.
Everybody out there, you can label me as a tree hugger, environmentalist that likes to shoot stuff. That's my concluding thought.
Like shoot trees. Andy, you didn't say a whole hell of a lot.
Yeah. Well,
This is the first time you ever sat in on one of these conversations.
yeah, and I thanks for the opportunity to let me sit in. It's interesting stuff. I learned quite a bit.
Do you have any concluding thoughts?
Well,
You're probably thinking about that big lingcod you got to flay.
yeah. Well,
Andy's got a cooler with 2 lingcod on ice that won't fit in the fridge.
yeah. Well, like Randall, I came from a non-hunting family, so this is all good knowledge. It's stuff that I didn't grow up thinking about. So this is good to hear. And yeah, congratulations on getting through it. And
Thank you.
sounds like a pretty interesting piece.
I can't tell if you're allowed to have concluding thoughts or not. What do you think? Does Randall get concluding thoughts?
Yeah, I think so.
Oh, they
Alright,
don't
what's
want to
your-
hear me. They don't want to
No,
hear
what's
me
your
ramble.
concluding thought? It's
Oh.
just a little tradition of having concluding thoughts.
I'm just happy and honored to be here.
No,
It's been a
don't
good time.
come on, dude. Don't start. Don't give me the old.
All right,
look.
well then visit your local bookseller in about 2 years once we get this thing on the shelf and pick it up and.
we'll get it put up on. We'll get it put up when your book comes out. We'll get it put up on our website. And Janis, maybe we'll get a deal where you buy 100 T-shirts, you get a copy for free.
There you go.
How about 100 bucks and get a T-shirt for free?
You slum in a package.
All right, man, I just now I feel guilty to the listeners that we've been discussing and because usually a book will get published and then you go and you talk about it,
Yeah.
Because now I'm like, stay tuned, because someday you'll be able to read this book.
When do you think it'll be available?
There's no way of knowing.
It's hard
No
to
way.
say. Yeah, it's hard to say once you start setting out queries to presses. You never know what the timeline is. So we'll see.
Yeah.
But
Well, we got the basic idea. It was fascinating, man.
thank you.
I'm glad. I'm glad
Appreciate
you're
the
able
interest.
to. I'm glad you're able to come and talk about this. I mean, definitely stuff I never thought about, and some stuff I had thought about, but I thought about it wrong.
Yeah, I mean, it was a different, when I set out to write the thing, I thought I was going to tell one story, and I realized that there are so many more stories out there. And I guess, if you're interested in this, if the listeners are interested in this stuff, Outdoor Life just recently digitized their whole back catalog to like 1887, 88, something like that.
Is that
So
right?
you can buy a monthly, yeah. And so this saved me because prior to that, I was carrying home these huge bound volumes that weighed like 20 pounds a piece, and it was like 10 issues of Outdoor Life, and I was just hauling them back from the library in my backpack. And then, in January, I'm cranking through this thing, and you can go online now and get a subscription. It's like $5 a month or something.
Is that right?
And they have full page scans, so you can look at the advertisements, all that stuff. And then Field and Stream too is available on Google Books digitally from like 1968 to the early 2000s. So if you want to
Yeah,
go
so
back
you
and-
listeners can go out and write your own damn dissertations.
Yeah, go out and
I'd be curious to have someone go do a dissertation on the changing nature of chewing tobacco ads
yeah.
in Field and Stream and Outdoor Life.
Oh yeah, there's a rich history there.
All right. Thanks for listening. We'll keep making them. Keep listening. Take care.